Okay, good morning, everyone. We begin. Welcome to those of you who are here in the sanctuary, and welcome to those who are joining us on live stream or will watch this Bible study later on YouTube. I want to give you an update on a number of our people, some of whom have been on our prayer chain and some not. I had the privilege of visiting a number of people yesterday. Joanne Johnson, who's living at Palos Verde on 87th, and she celebrated her 90th birthday on Sunday. Her family were here, gave her a lovely party, which was really nice, and she is in a wheelchair now because of her hip, but she still plays the piano for the little worship service they have within that facility, and tries to keep as active as she can. She really misses coming to church. Some of you will remember when she used to come when they had a bus that would bring her, and they can't get drivers apparently for the bus, and realistically she would not be well enough to come on the bus even if they had one. But she sends you all her love. I talked to Ingeborg Jones. Sam Jones had a fall the last time we had Bible study. Fortunately, Sam did not break anything, but he fell on his tailbone, and that is very painful. He went to ER. They said there might be hairline fractures because they don't show up on the x-ray unless it's a real break. But he's in quite a bit of pain, and he's not able to be out just at the moment. I went to see Chuck in Geneva, and he is looking better and feeling a little bit stronger and very glad to be home. So he is doing a little bit better. Sid Fawcett, who recently had a fall, in fact, his head injury was so severe that when they took him to hospital, they ended up putting 15 staples in his head. And then he went, when they got him to hospital, they found he had COVID, and then he moved from the hospital to one rehab facility and then another one just along the street here, and he's back home last Thursday with Yoshi. But he's looking a lot better than I expected to find him. Jean Bryn had her surgery and says she feels great and hopes to be in church this Sunday. Jan Carter is on her way back right now from Nevada, and she's still making progress. We hope for better progress with her eyes. They're trying to get the pressure in her eyes just right, and of course her sight is at risk because of that, and they're trying different medication with Jan to see what will really work. And finally, Jo Jansen, she had her surgery, had the hip surgery, was in rehab in a new facility, and moved back to the Ridges. And she's using a scooter when she's in the Ridges to get around and so on, no doubt to the risk of all the other residents. And her son was with her last week, son and his wife, and then Carol, her daughter, is with her currently, and she will leave there on Saturday, I think it is. So I said I'd pop in and see her next week. So that's an update on some of our people that you have been thinking about and praying about. So let's begin with a word of prayer. God of majesty and power, you are the beginning and the end of all things. You are higher than our highest thoughts, greater than we can ever begin to imagine. There's nothing you're unable to do. No one you're unable to change. You're always at work in our lives, and we ask that you'd receive our praise this morning. We ask for your blessing for the dear friends we've just been thinking about. We ask that you'll continue to help them in healing and strength, those who are recovering from surgery, and those who are in rehab facilities, those who are recovering at home. We ask for your blessing upon them. As we study your word, let your word speak to our hearts and minds as it is spoken across the running centuries. And let your word be a blessing to us today and in the coming days. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, we're turning to the last section of Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 19 through 30. And the theme of that section, you will remember that the overall theme of Paul's letter is joy. It's a joy-filled letter, despite his circumstances, despite the fact that he's in a Roman dungeon in Rome, awaiting execution. Paul is joyful, and he expresses that joy in various ways and to various people. And in this section, the overall theme in verses 19 through 30 of the second chapter is the joy of ministry. And he focuses on two friends who he's very grateful for. And we're going to really focus a little bit on the idea of friendship. I don't know if you've heard this little poem. It goes like this. Count your garden by the flowers, never by the leaves that fall. Count your day by golden hours, don't remember clouds at all. Count your nights by stars, not shadows. Count your life with smiles, not tears. And with joy on every birthday, count your age by friends, not years. Nice idea, isn't it? Counting your birthday, not on the number of years you've been around, but the number of friends you're blessed to have. All of us are blessed to have friends. Now, Paul has a lot of friends. He talks, for instance, in some of the letters about what he owes to Mark. Mark has a shaky start with Paul, as you remember. He sets off on the first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas. Then he sort of gets cold feet and he deserts them. He goes back home. He's very young at that particular time. And Paul is not sympathetic to that situation. But sometime after that, Mark manages to redeem himself in Paul's eyes. And Paul talks about in the latter part of his ministry how useful Mark is. Then you have Luke, who was a tremendous friend to Paul. And if you read through the Acts of the Apostles, you discover what are called the we passages, where Dr. Luke writes and he mentions, we went here, we did this, we saw that. And on those passages, Dr. Luke is with Paul, and maybe with Silas, or maybe with Timothy, but certainly always with Paul. And he's describing personal experiences. There are other passages where Luke wasn't there, and so he's not an eyewitness. Then there's Timothy, and we're going to look at Timothy in a minute. Then there's Silas, and so on. And Paul has faithful friends, but he also is upset by someone like Demas. He mentions Demas in the little book of Philemon. And in Philemon, he says that Demas has left me. Demas has abandoned Christian ministry and gone back into the world. And that, Paul feels that deeply and personally. But real friends are special, precious, and rare. I hope all of you have a 3 a.m. friend. That's someone that you could call up at 3 a.m. when you're in trouble. Don't call them up to ask them, what's the name of that lady who sits in front of us in church? You know, you have to have something really important to talk to someone about at 3 a.m. But they will come to your rescue. They will help you. They will be there for you. Now, in this closing section, Paul commends and pays tribute to two friends. So let's look at it together. So we're at Philippians chapter 2, and we're going to pick up at verse 19. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him, who takes a genuine interest in your welfare. For everyone looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me. But I am confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I am all the more eager to send him, so that you may see him again and be glad and may have less anxiety. Welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor men like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help you could not give me. So, in this section, Paul focuses on the friendship and the help and the devotion of these two people. Now, you see that Paul talks about Timothy as a son. And you've got to understand, he wasn't a son in the flesh, but he was a son in the faith. He wasn't his biological son, but he thought of him with great affection, with great regard, and so on. He was Paul's prodigy in every way. He was a colleague, he was a friend, he was the closest thing to a son that Paul had. And you find Paul throughout the New Testament letters, he's always promoting Timothy, building up Timothy, encouraging Timothy, and bringing him forward. For instance, we know that in 6 of the New Testament letters that Paul wrote, he links Timothy's name in with his own. He will say things like, Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ, send you greetings, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that Timothy co-authored the letter. He didn't. Paul is just being gracious and generous to this young preacher, to this young man, and saying, he's with me, he's a tremendous support and a help to me. And 6 times Paul does this. He draws Timothy in to this. Now, Timothy had a Greek father and a Jewish mother and grandmother. And that meant that in some places he was viewed with skepticism and some suspicion. Now, in verse 19 and 20, he says, I'm sending to you Timothy. I hope to send Timothy to you. And what he's saying is, I'm sending the best man I have because you are special to me and because he is special to me, is what he's saying. You're getting the deluxe treatment. Paul's mission is twofold. He is to go to Philippi and to spend time with them, to preach, to teach, to strengthen and encourage the church, to encourage the individual Christians. Now, we know that there is the possibility of a growing problem within the church in Philippi. There are 2 prominent women, it's mentioned in chapter 4, that Paul is concerned that they are beginning to cause the church to have 2 factions. And there may be a split. And one of the things that Paul is anxious about is that Timothy can go and bring these 2 women together, reunite the church, and to stop things before they become too difficult. He's going to spend time with them in Philippi. He's going to tell them how Paul is doing. He's going to give them all the latest news from Rome. And then he's going to come back from Philippi to Paul and bring Paul the news from Philippi. Now, we travel relatively easy. We have cars, we have trains, we have buses, we have airplanes, we have all kinds of things. So think for a minute what a journey like that would involve. Well, here's what it would involve. Timothy, to go back to Philippi, would start his journey by walking from Rome to Brindisi on the Italian coast. That's a journey of 350 miles. So he would begin with a 350-mile journey to the coast. Then he would get on a boat. he would travel 90 miles across the sea to the coast of Greece, and then he would have to walk from the coast of Greece to Philippi. And that's a 360-mile journey. That's an 800-mile one-way trip. And then he's got to do the same on the way back to come back to report to Paul in Rome and bring the latest news. Now, we don't know if Timothy made that trip, and we don't know if when he got back, Paul was still alive. Because all this time, when he would be walking these many miles and sailing across the sea and coming back again, Paul by this stage may have been executed by the Roman emperor. But think of the commitment to that. You know, we say, oh yeah, I mean, Randy and I recently drove down to Casa Grande to meet with some people from another church, and we thought we were adventurers. You know, I was a bit surprised when Randy brought a tent and rations for 3 days and so on. And, you know, I said to him, well, we will be back before dark, even with my driving, you know. But think of making an 800-mile one-way trip to visit the church at Philippi and then to have to come all the way back.
Is there any could he have not walked all the time? Is there a way to...
Well, that's kind of speculation. You know, we both biblical experts and sort of cultural experts say, well, for a short distance you may hop a ride on a cart where a merchant is going somewhere, but you know, that might be only 10 miles or 20 miles or something, but it's possible. But nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the fact of making an 800-mile one-way trip without any of the modern convenience that we think about. It's still a heck of a commitment, but it is possible, Randy, that maybe they could hitch a ride on something and so on. But so Paul is here encouraging Timothy, telling the church in Philippi, I'm going to send you the best man I have. I'm going to send you the guy who is my greatest help, my greatest support, my son in the faith. Now, Paul is always protective of Timothy. Listen to what he writes to the church in Corinth about Timothy. If Timothy comes to you, see that he has nothing to fear. While he is with you, he is carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am. No one should refuse to accept him. He writes that in 1 Corinthians 10. And we know from other passages that Timothy had various problems. He was youthful. He also appears to be of a nervous disposition. He's a little bit hesitant. He's inexperienced. There is this concern, and Paul is always bolstering him, supporting him, encouraging him, and really, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but if you read that passage again from 1 Corinthians 16, there's almost a threat, I think, implied in it. You know, when Paul writes, if Timothy comes to you, see that he has nothing to fear. While he is with you, for he is carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am, no one should refuse to accept him. And what to me is the unspoken rest of that sentence is, because if he has trouble, you're going to answer to me. It seems to be what Paul is saying. You better treat him right. You better be good to him. You better not abuse this young man, because he is working in the Lord. So Paul is always trying to treat Timothy properly. He's protective of him and he's caring. Now, Paul turns to the second guy. Pick it up at verse 25, please. But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. Now, who is this guy? He's one of the unsung heroes of the New Testament. He's mentioned here. We know very little about him. What we do know is all caught up in this. He was a respectable member of the church in Philippi, and the church in Philippi sent him to Rome with gifts for the Apostle Paul, and maybe with money for the Apostle Paul. Bear in mind, in ancient prisons, the prison authorities didn't feed you. They didn't provide food. It was expected that your family or friends would bring you food to the prison every day. And so they send him things that Paul needs. They send him a warm cloak to keep him warm. They send him parchment so that he can continue to write. They send him ink. They send him all the necessities. And so this guy Epaphroditus, he comes to Rome loaded down with gifts and presents and so on for the Apostle Paul. He's sent by the church in Philippi with great affection and great regard. Now, and he's asked to stay. The church in Philippi clearly asked him to stay in Rome while Paul was in prison or while Paul was under house arrest, and to do absolutely everything in his power to take care of Paul, to look after him, to protect him. And here is Paul sending him back. Now, we know that he became seriously ill during his time in Rome. So we don't know what he became ill with, but he was restored to health. And Paul is sending him back. And he's also sending him, if you think about it, he is carrying this letter to the church in Philippi with him. He's the mail carrier. Someone asked a few weeks ago, well, how did some of these letters get to the various churches? And they got there because someone agreed they would go. And they would go to these churches, they would, to the pastor or leaders of the church, they would deliver Paul's letter, and that letter would be read out at least one service, probably 2 or 3 services, and that's how they got. Well, we know how this one got. Epaphroditus took it with him. Now, as I say, he's one of the unsung heroes of the New Testament. He didn't write any books. He didn't hold any office. He wasn't a pastor, wasn't a teacher. We hear his name because Paul is anxious about him, and he's anxious to send him back. And Paul honors him by calling him a brother, and he calls him a fellow worker. And he goes further. He calls him a fellow soldier. You know, that he's working in conjunction with Paul, but he's also a fellow soldier. It's never enough in ministry to be just a worker. We have to learn to be a warrior in God's army. Christianity, and more so in our Western culture, is under attack. And there are a lot of Christians who are fine until someone asks them to stand up and be counted. And then they are invisible. Some Christians are fine until they're asked to speak out on an issue in the office they work in, or the factory they work in, or the building site they work in, and someone will say, well, you're one of these Christians, aren't you? What has abortion got to do with you? Or what is this issue, or the gay issue, or whatever it happens to be? And so there are Christians who are willing to go to church, but they're not willing to put their head above the parapet. They're not willing to speak out on the faith. They're not willing to defend their faith. They either feel afraid or they feel inadequate. Now, here Paul encourages him to go back to his church and for them not to be anxious about him. He has risked his health, Paul says, and his life because of his commitment to Christ and the church. And while the church family in Philippi were worried about him, he was guilty, but he felt guilty because they had heard about his sickness and they were worried about him. So he calls on the church to receive him joyfully, to honor him, to treat him with great respect, and to recognize all that he did on journeying to Rome, all that he did for Paul when he was in Rome, the risks that he took, the illness that he recovered from, and now here he is going back to Rome. Paul recognizes his worth. Now, if it were not for Paul's mentioning of this man, we wouldn't know a thing about him. As I say, he's one of the unsung heroes of the faith. He's one of the unknown people. Every church has dozens of people whose name never gets into the bulletin, never makes it into the Roadrunner, but they're faithful, consistent, they support the church, they do things, and often they fly under the radar, and no one really notices them until they're not there. Now, I don't know, have you ever seen the movie Chariots of Fire? Well, at the end of the movie Chariots of Fire, at the end of the credits, this is what it says. Eric Liddell, missionary, died in occupied China at the end of World War II. All of Scotland mourned. I have a connection with Eric Liddell, not just because of the movie, but long before that. When I was a child growing up in Belfast, we used to collect money in Sunday school for the LMS. The LMS was the London Missionary Society. And it was the missionary society that sent out some famous missionaries, like David Livingstone went out to Africa under the London Missionary Society. Eric Liddell went to China, and so on. And we used to collect money to support the LMS because the LMS was the missionary society of the Congregational Union of England and Wales. And Eric Liddell was an Olympic runner, and he won Olympic gold in the 1924 Paris Olympics. A year after winning Olympic gold, he went as a missionary through the LMS to China. Now, when he first went to China, he was teaching in a college, and then he would go out and he would conduct Bible studies in villages and things like that. And his work continued. That's 1925 he started there. And then you will remember that the Japanese invaded China before World War II began, and he ended up being categorized as an enemy agent, and he was put into a prison camp, and he really had a rough time in the prison camp. The Japanese herded hundreds of people into a little camp that was probably not even as big as this sanctuary. They lived in squalid conditions. They were short of food. They had almost nothing in the way of medicine. And in that camp, Liddell did a marvelous job. He kept people's spirits up. He led Bible studies. He organized games and activities, athletics. He taught hymns to the local people who were also imprisoned in the camp. He taught them the Bible. He helped care for the sick. There was a young man who was about 13 when he was in the camp alongside Eric Liddell, and this is what he wrote about Eric Liddell. None of us will ever forget this man who was totally committed to his Christianity, a man whose humble life combined muscular Christianity with radiant godliness. That's how he described him. As a young, impressionable teenager, he saw this man in the camp, and he exhibited all these Christ-like characters. And he took care of people, he sacrificed himself, he shared his food with people who had less, and so on. Just weeks before the camp was due to be liberated, Eric Liddell died of a brain tumor in the Japanese camp. He was a true hero of the faith, and he was a hero to millions in Scotland. Scotland were very proud of Eric Liddell. You'll find monuments in different places in Scotland to him, to his athletic ability, to his prowess, and also to his Christian stand for things he believed in, and for sacrificing his life in China. He was offered, after he won Olympic gold, he was offered all kinds of positions in Britain, all kinds of money, because we didn't have a whole lot of Olympic gold medalists in those days. And to get his name on the headed notepaper of a company or some organization, they were willing to pay Eric Liddell a great deal of money in the 20s, in the hungry 20s. But he was committed to Christ, and he went to China as a missionary. And he died there, serving the Lord. He was a true hero. So, here is Epaphroditus, just a church member. He's not an apostle, not a preacher, not a teacher, not a pastor. He was a fellow worker. He was a fellow warrior. And Paul dedicates this last section to thanking two people who have been so helpful and so supportive and so encouraging and have devoted themselves to him and to the Christ that they serve. We're going to end at that point. Has anyone got any questions on what we've been looking at? No? Oh my goodness. Yes, Carl.
How many days was Timothy's journey?
Well, we don't know. We really don't know. We have no way of knowing. We know how long it was, but we don't know how long it took. And Randy made the point that maybe sometimes they could have ridden in a cart or something, but it's still, it's still, when you think of it, took them 350 miles to get out of Italy. And then the 90-mile sea voyage. And in those days, the boats would hug along the coast because they couldn't maneuver terribly well. And then he got over to Greece, and then he had another 360 miles across Greece. Long, long way. But we don't know how long it took, but we know how far it was and the dedication that he had in doing it. Anyone else? No? Okay, thank you so much, everybody. And we'll continue. We'll open up chapter 3 next time, which will be next week. And now that we've got that mammoth event called the Rummage Sale out of the way. Thank you, everyone.